Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard-to-explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
All right. So, Frank, we've crossed paths a few times in different ways, but my first encounter with you was through your book, Crazy for God. Crazy for God, How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, helped found the religious right, and lived to take all of it, or almost all of it, back. And here's a blurb about the book. By the time he was 19, Frank Schaeffer's parents, Francis and Edith Schaeffer, had achieved global fame as best-selling evangelical authors and speakers. And Frank had joined his father on the evangelical circuit. He would go on to speak before thousands in arenas around America, publish his own evangelical bestseller, and work with such figures as Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and Dr. James Dobson. But all the while, Schaeffer felt increasingly alienated, precipitating a crisis of faith that would ultimately lead to his departure, even if it meant losing everything. With honesty, empathy, and humor, Schaeffer delivers a brave and important book. A fascinating insider's look at the American evangelical movement and a deeply affecting personal odyssey of faith. So welcome, Carrie and I are so glad to have you here, Frank. I am confident that we will bring some relief and hope to all of our listeners. So go ahead and hop in to this conversation, Frank, and tell us where you are in this moment. Well, you're not there. You're not where you were when you wrote that book.
No, for one thing, I wrote that in my mid-50s, and now I'm 71, so I'm considerably closer to death. How's that for an opening?
That's a perspective, for sure.
Yeah, like Princess Bride, mostly dead. But anyway, I'm sitting up here in New England in the middle of the remnants of a snowstorm. I guess somebody on your team is in California. Where are you guys right now?
Carrie's in New Jersey.
Yeah,
and I'm in California.
And David, what part of California are you in?
Santa Barbara.
All right. And where are you in New Jersey, Carrie?
I am about 15 minutes outside of Newark, New Jersey, and about a half an hour outside of New York City. So I'm about to get the storm that's probably going to hit you in a little while.
Yeah, it's coming this way. And anyway, yes. My life has been a journey that has taken me through several careers and several belief systems. And I think, aside from the fact that I'm old, I'm nearing the end of the journey in the sense that I've kind of washed up in a place where spirituality is still important to me. But when it comes to belief systems, I think accurately describe myself as an atheist intellectually, but one who still prays because of the way he was raised. And my answer to someone who says, well, how can that be? I wrote a little book called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, and that's kind of an oxymoron contradiction. But I think that that's part of my journey in embracing paradox instead of certainty. And I think paradox is the certainty. I don't think that there is another way to look at life that shows any kind of learning curve as you get older. I'm a grandfather of 5 and a father of 3. And I've been married to Jeannie for 53 years since I got her pregnant when we were 17 and 18. And the paradoxical nature of my own life, a teenage pregnancy marriage that turned out into a very happy life of 53 years with one woman when all the odds were stacked against it. And yet there you go. I didn't do the big sensible thing and get career and money and all that. And then I left an evangelical position of making gobs of money as a sidekick to an evangelical superstar, became a little bit one myself, walked away from power, if you want to put it that way, and embraced instead the life of a writer, which is a much more difficult kind of path economically to raise kids on. And then walked away from my Christian faith altogether in terms of intellectual commitment, and have wound up paradoxically more spiritual, more loving, and behaving more as if I actually followed the teachings of Jesus than when I did. How's that?
Love it.
Frank, when we hosted you maybe a year ago for our church, I remember I was in a small group a few days ahead of that meeting. And in this group, I mentioned that, this Sunday, we're having Frank Schaeffer. And I guess there was a time you were known as Frankie Schaeffer.
Oh, yes. Part of my journey has been name changing. And then I figured out that's not the problem, what you call yourself. So you can call me Sam, as far as I'm concerned. I don't care.
Well, anyway.
Or Sammy, the diminutive, whatever you want.
When I mentioned that, we were going to be hosting you, I remember there was an older gentleman who said, Frankie Schaeffer, he has a real edge. Which is not really the way that I know you, even though I've read your books from back then. In terms of, we've talked on the phone and communicated online in a couple of different ways. And I didn't get that. And then you wrote this book. You sent me an advance copy about love. Let's see, something be still.
A long, complicated title. Fall in love, have children. Stay put, save the planet, be happy.
Yeah. So when I read that, I did notice that you were different. Okay. And so the way that I shared with this group, how I have encountered you is you're like a cuddly grandfather now. I
guess so.
Am I, you guess so. What do you mean by that?
Well, depending on the day, you could ask Jeannie, my wife, my best friend, lover, and confidant, if I'm a cuddly grandfather, and she'd say maybe 85% of the time, the rest of the time he's a dysfunctional, scary son of a bitch. It depends how you look at it. I bring some baggage with me that doesn't make me that easy to live with, but, thankfully, all kidding aside, I've had the good fortune to be loved by a woman who changed me. And one of the ways she changed me is she encouraged me to go seek therapy about 20 years ago and really deal with some issues and profoundly dig deep into them. She told me that, she wasn't into harsh discipline with my children the way I had been raised with in an evangelical fundamentalist background. So we made some conscious choices. And I know this will sound odd, but eventually, I don't know how to put this, but who I actually was inside began to catch up with who I wanted to be. And this will sound hypocritical, but I found that if you want to behave differently and better, say in your attitude toward how you treat women or minorities or people you disagree with, pretend you're a good person for a while. And pretty soon you actually learn how to do that and it becomes you. I think sincerity is the most overrated virtue. And so basically, it's not how you feel. It's how you treat people. It's what they see. And I think that eventually helped heal some real dysfunction. And I have PTSD sort of flashbacks into that dysfunction. But as a grandfather who's been doing childcare for the last 15 years for my 3 youngest grandchildren, and I don't mean Jeannie's been doing it and I help a little. I mean, I'm doing it. I really have changed. I'm not the person I was, and I've journeyed a long way away from that, quote, biblical worldview that puts women as second-class citizens and children are supposed to be disciplined and men are in charge of everything. I had to fake it for a while and pretend that wasn't me when it still was. And about 20 years ago, the shift really began. And so now I've kind of wound up at a place where Jeannie's actually pretty happy living with me. But it's a journey.
That's awesome. I hear in what you're saying, this beautiful story of becoming, right? Which I think is, I say something to my beloveds where I say I reserve my right to become who I'm going to become, and I reserve the right to my own becoming because I don't know who I'm going to be tomorrow. And I think that the more that we age, the older we get, the softer we become, the less hard edges we have, because I think we have more experiences that enable us to relate to people. So I'm so curious because, especially around your story with walking away from power, and how that changed your relationship and your view of women. I'm really curious about that. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that because some of the work that I do is in the area of dominance and systems of dominance, identities of dominance. And one of the annoying aspects of that work has been I have developed more compassion for straight white men because there is a wound of dominance there. And I think a lot of that is born from evangelicalism. So can you talk a little bit about the hard edges that form evangelical men and how you changed from that?
Well, let's get back to your question. And being an old guy, I'm going to forget what it was. So you're going to remind me in a minute. But first, I have to satisfy my own curiosity. Remember, I do my own podcast now. So I'm more used to interviewing than being interviewed. So let me change hats for a minute, Carrie, and ask you about yourself. When you do the work that you're talking about, what's the context? What's your background? Where do you come from? Who are you? Pretend you're on my podcast for a minute. Tell me about yourself. Then remind me what your question about me was.
Absolutely. So I guess my public world started with a blog called Jersey Girl Jesus that was on Pathos. And then I had the immense pleasure of writing 3 books, but the 2 most popular ones are, the first one is called Good White Racist, Confronting Your Role in Racial Injustice, which led to a second book. And that was mainly about white identity, deconstructing white identity, helping white people to do that. And that led to a second book called Wait, Is This Racist, which is a guide for churches, white churches who want to become more anti-racist. I'm currently in a doctoral program at seminary where I'm working on my thesis will be something around systems of dominance, probably autoethnographic
and what
systems.
seminary are you at?
Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis.
Okay. And then you were talking about a partner. So who's your partner? I'm not asking for names and addresses, but just describe that relationship a little bit since I've told you something about mine.
My partner, well, I'm currently separated actually. So I'm a single mom to 2 amazing teenagers, one who is in college and one who is a sophomore in high school. So,
well, I'm old enough to say something like this without it being considered inappropriate. But, right now I'm looking at you and you look like you're the age that you say your children are. So what's that all?
Well, thank you. I don't know what that's about. I think it's probably a filter, but I'm 54. So I wish I was as young as my kids, but alas.
And then is this a girl or a boy?
I have a girl and a boy.
And then who was the older and the younger?
My daughter is older. She just finished her first semester in college, and my son is a sophomore in high school.
And did you come from an evangelical background yourself?
When I have a very mystical experience. I had a mystical experience with who I called Jesus when I was 3. My mom took me to the Methodist church and I saw the pictures of white Jesus on the wall. I said, wow, that guy looks really sad. I hope he starts feeling better soon. That's not the guy that I met on the road. And then when I was in my early 20s, I followed a boy to what ended up being a fundamentalist Southern Baptist church in New York City that had about 12 members, all of whom were Broadway performers. So the music was amazing. And it was incredibly dysfunctional. And then left there, found myself on staff at a large megachurch here in the New York City area. And eventually left because I wanted to be able to write freely in support of the LGBTQ community, etc. And I had been told I was not permitted to write about divisive topics. So I left.
Now, did you get your books published somewhere by somebody who liked them, or how'd that work out?
I was approached by an editor at WJK, Westminster John Knox, and Jessica reached out to me. She said, I've been reading your blog. I would love for you to submit a book proposal, which is an immense privilege and
yeah, I know those.
blessing.
I don't know that person, but I get mailings from them. I kind of follow. Okay, so you had a question for me. Sorry that I went on.
That's
about
okay.
here.
I appreciate
really
the
am curious.
opportunity to tell you a little bit about me. So thank you. So
basically, next time you have a book, call my producer Ernie and let's talk to you about your new book, whatever that turns out to be. Or if one of those books is relatively new and you want to talk about it, come be on my podcast.
Amazing. Awesome. I would love that. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I'd enjoy this.
So yeah, it would be fun. So my question for you is, I would love to know about the hard edges of evangelicalism and what they do to men, and how you softened those edges specifically around the relationship to women. And because I think it's so important for straight white men to talk about their departure from positions of power and how they got there. I think that's so important.
Well, I'm being a little facetious by the language I'm about to use, but not really. I describe myself somewhere in something I'm writing right now, and I always write better than I say it back. You know how that is as a writer. You write the line well,
Indeed.
And then when you're telling somebody what you wrote, it's like, shit, that's not the punchline. But anyway, I wrote something to the effect that from birth forward, I was groomed, this is in my evangelical fundamentalist past, to become an asshole by divine right. In other words, all my training from my mother's knee up was basically to take my position as a man of God who would be obeyed by the women in my life. My wife would be a helpmeet, quote unquote, who was there to help me fulfill God's leadership role bestowed upon all males, especially white males, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't think of a training that would be more in line with the worst aspects of every human desire, not just men. Power over others, being obeyed, getting your way, always somehow being right. If you're in an argument, it's the other person's fault because you've got this high call. And I can't think of a worse way to be trained to be a father, which is you're in charge and don't let anybody disrespect you. They got to listen. And so all kidding aside, if you follow that and you wind up as an asshole, it was by divine right, so that you always had this excuse that, this God is calling me to this leadership position, whether you've shown any qualities of leadership or not, just because you're born. So it's a point of view of total entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's terrible for men, women, straight, gay, black, white, brown. I don't care. If that's your view of life, then you wind up like Elon Musk telling the chairman of Disney to go fuck himself as your response to him dropping advertising because you're always right. And that's the epitome of that. So, when I got married to Jeannie and we were teenagers, I hadn't put my head up above the parapet and seen a bigger world at all at that point. This is all I knew. And Jeannie and I fell in love chemically and bonded and were there. And she came from a very different background as a San Francisco girl who had been raised by a lawyer and, had seen the Beatles live 3 times in concert and the Rolling Stones and, was going out with a friend of hers who was a drummer in Santana. And that was her background. And she came to our little ministry in Switzerland, Liberty Fellowship, along with a lot of other hippies and backpackers and stuff. And essentially she and I got together. We met actually over the Beatles album, Abbey Road, that she hadn't heard yet. She'd been on the road. And I said, I had it downstairs in my studio, like some Dracula prince taking you to the cave. And 53 years later, we're still together. So, it worked. And, but then gradually, as I journeyed out of the evangelical world, one of my reasons for that, if I could put it this way, was every time I was out on the road in a big speaking gig, like speaking to the Southern Baptist Annual Convention to 23,000 pastors, taking my dad's place when he was having chemotherapy at the Mayo Clinic for his cancer, I would come off the road angry because I was really disappointed with what I was part of and more angry with myself, and basically was treating her worse because of the success in that environment. So one of the big questions I had about my own role of evangelical leadership, albeit as a sidekick to my father in that kind of nepotistic environment that evangelicals specialize in, with these father-son and father-daughter and father, and cousin and relatives all sucked into whatever the ministry is and on the payroll. I really love Jeannie. And one of my motivations for getting out of the evangelical world is it fed all my worst instincts. Plus, since I was so angry with myself for being part of this flaky, rip-off con artist system, I was taking it out on her. And when I started going to therapy and when I started really being more honest with myself about this and the dysfunction that I had inherited because of that, that was one reason I walked away from everything. It wasn't a philosophical issue with me. It was that I loved Jeannie enough to try to be a better person for her. She motivated it more than anything else. And that's basically it. So, having been groomed to be this asshole by divine right, I found that the first thing to do was to say, gee, I was taught wrong. None of this is true. I've just finished reading a book, and I'm going to interview her on my podcast next week or the week after. Kat Bohannon has written this incredible book called Eve, and the subtitle is something like 200 Million Years of Female Evolution and How It Led the Human Race. Again, I've said it worse than the actual thing is, but she's a PhD in field of neurological evolution and development. She's written this incredible book. And once again, here's little old me who thought the world had been created in 6 days and God was in charge of everything and don't know much about evolution. And I've done a lot of reading since then. But once again, Kat's book was filled with things about what women really are, how they really developed, what our real relationship is. And so I'm mentioning that only because part of my education away from that kind of disorder of behavior of superiority was simply to actually get some real information for once. And lied to. Eve didn't come from Adam's side. She's not my sidekick. So part of the healing is not very complicated. It's just like, are you open to facts?
Okay, so let me ask here, Frank. Yeah. I remember telling my kids more than once when they're all adults and some of them have their own kids now, but when they were living with Diane and me here, I remember telling them more than once, I'm really glad that your dad does not lead a megachurch or a huge ministry.
Right.
Because, and I explained to them because, and I know that this is not always the way it plays out in some true philanthropic urban Black ministries or brown ministries. But generally speaking, I said, if I did have this huge operation, you might not have a choice but to participate in it.
Right.
And because, and I don't even know if I really knew all of the reasons, but I did know that that's what I saw being played out in the world, that if you had this huge operation, your son would be in charge, or maybe your daughter would be behind the camera or whatever, and so, my reasoning for that, I was more intuitive than filled with knowledge. But then it was verified over the years. I think that when I finally came across your book, Crazy for God, it kind of affirmed that in me. But I still don't know exactly the dynamics, and maybe for different people it happens differently. But what goes on in your mind when you are the heir of this operation, and how, and you don't know how you're going to survive economically, because you're used to depending on that. So what does that feel like?
Well, first of all, a little background. You're totally correct when it comes to my family. All my brothers-in-law who married my 3 older sisters that are all older than me, all came into my parents' ministry. and wound up running it. And then after my dad and mom died, wound up fighting over it and splitting the work over a power struggle. So not only have my family been there, done that, Jeannie and I talk all the time about how lucky we were on so many fronts. But one was escaping before a shitstorm. Because if I had tried to keep the heir apparent and stuck in there, I would have been in the middle of all that. And I was out a good 20 years before all that happened, almost 30 years before all that happened. It's just kind of a footnote. But I think you were hitting on it when you were saying economically. You got to understand, luckily, I know this is going to sound incredibly pretentious, okay, but I really don't mean it that way. And I don't have anything to prove. Remember, I'm old and I'm going to die soon. So now I have to always tell the truth. These may be my last words, okay? So, it's fair shit when your days are numbered. But luckily, and again, I'm sorry, but I'm a really good writer. And so when my first novel, Portofino, came out, having me flayed around for years on these shit careers in Hollywood and crappy things I did and evangelical this and that, luckily, when Jeannie urged me to write a novel based on my own childhood experiences, she was onto something, as usual, correct. And it worked and got good international acclaim and reviews and sold tons of copies and all the rest of it. Gave me permission to keep being a writer because fortunately, I actually had a talent. And that's luck. That's not anything to do with me. It's just I was able to write because, God damn it, I'm uneducated. I ran away from a British boys' boarding school at age 15 and never went back to school. I'm totally self-educated. I read, I traveled, I spoke to the point where my son, John, who was a Marine, had a standing joke when I was asked to go on the lecture circuit to fancy colleges, wherever, if I was at Harvard or Princeton or something as an author. And by the way, they never asked me where I went to school because I was published and had a thing. If you're a published author and you're being taken seriously, that's the credential. But the funny thing is he would always tell me, and, on the keep me humble front, he said, Dad, why don't, when you're down there, fill in the blank, Princeton or Harvard or something, why don't you get them to give you an honorary high school diploma? Not doctorate, high school diploma.
Right.
Hey. So, who's Frank Schaeffer? He's a guy who got his girlfriend pregnant when they were 17 and 18. He ran away from boarding school, never went back to school. He's totally self-educated. And luckily, he actually has a writer's talent, which he's honed over the years so that he's not a total fucking failure. That's who I am. And if I hadn't had that, literally, Jeannie and I would have, Jeannie fortunately started a little company that she ran very well, and that earned more money than I was earning for about 20 years. But even so, it was either be a successful author, and I know this sounds stupid, or work at Walmart. I don't have a fallback position. I don't know how to do shit. So when answering your question, David, I didn't get the education to do anything else. Yeah. And I didn't have any knowledge about things. I was homeschooled. I was sent off to boarding schools. I ran away. Well, in other words, for me, the opportunity to be my dad's sidekick was logical because it's all I knew how to do. I had sat for hours listening to him preach, do discussions, travel. I was with him as a teenager when he spoke at places like Wheaton College or Liberty College or, all these Christian schools. I was groomed to do that shit. I knew how to do that. I didn't know how to do anything else until luckily I started writing, and then I could change my persona. And it's not a coincidence that only happened as I began to leave the movement.
Mm-hmm. So this is important, I think. You discovered that you are a writer.
Right.
And, this is one reason I was so free to tell my kids, I'm glad that you're not going to be my professional because they have gone on to do things that they want to do.
Right.
They're doing things that they have no, they're not being haunted by, I should be doing this or I should be doing that, because I've, heard that, Diane and I, we fully endorse these amazing careers. And I should point out one of my sons, all of them have just flowered, but one of my sons opened a nightclub on State Street in Santa Barbara. Is like a world famous strip, right?
Sure.
And he opened a nightclub 4 blocks away from where our church was meeting. And I remember I would tell our congregation from time to time, I would say, hey, look, tonight, so-and-so is going to be down the street. And people would tell me, this is probably the only church where they're telling you to go to a nightclub.
Yeah, sure.
When things are over. But I was so proud of him. I mean,
Absolutely.
Here's the thing, Frank. He had a number of employees, from bouncers to bartenders to entertainers and DJs and all of that. They were the most wonderful people.
Yeah.
He was basically doing what I do, but he was doing his thing. And so he was loving people, caring for them, bringing them over our house for Thanksgiving dinner, that kind of thing. And I feel like it would have been incredibly devastating for my kids' lives to not have the experiences that they're having right now. You did not get groomed, so to speak, directly to do what you're doing. But at some point you had to make a decision. You had to probably make a series of decisions to leave behind your supply. And in doing that, I'm curious as to because this is happening all over. I mean, we're seeing people now leaving behind a legacy, if you will. I think that you're kind of a pioneer, at least in my eyes. What is it that happens in your mind, in your soul, when this is happening?
Well, it's always hard to look back, and that's the problem of being a writer. And I know that Carrie will identify with this, and that somehow the minute you write down something that happens, you've killed it, in the sense by putting it on the page, it's not fluid anymore and it's not real anymore, even if you're a good writer, because the minute you make it official and write it down, now it's like dead on the page. It's not, it's part of history. It's like a fossil. So there's always a difference in my mind between the part of the story I've told in writing and the part that really happened. Not that I lie, but in the very writing of something down, in a way, you've kind of changed it and killed it because you've made it seem more rigid than it is. And as Carrie will know, having been a writer, books are just a snapshot of where you were that morning.
What an interesting perspective to apply to scripture.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's not like forever. It's just where you were that day. So that in looking back, my own memory now, David, is clouded by the fact that I've already gone through these evidences and artifacts in writing. And so now I don't know if I'm telling you what I really felt or what I remember writing down about something. And I don't have a good answer for you, because what was I thinking at the time? Well, in Crazy for God, I said this. In Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, maybe I said that. How I really felt that day, I don't know. And you know how they do in those, when you have people who are unjustly convicted and often on an eyewitness account, and the witness really thought they saw them at the scene of the crime, but they really weren't there. And our memories are very, very, very unstable. So I don't know whether I remember things accurately or if it's just a form of self-serving reconstruction of history, so I can get off the hook for something. But, to the best of my ability, all I can tell you is that I was comparing what I saw out there in big time American Christianity to the simplicity and love that I found in my parents' own ministry as a child that accepted everybody because they were good people. They were far better than their theology, which was harsh Calvinist Reformed theology. Secondly, so my childhood in that little ministry, whether you agree or disagree with what they were doing, they were not conning anybody. They were not stealing money. In that sense, they weren't grooming me to follow them and be their sidekick either. They were being nice to me by giving me a job when I couldn't do anything else, which I guess was partly their fault, and they knew it because I had been raised in this enclave. But be that as it may, okay, we'll let you can help with this documentary series your dad's doing called How Should We Then Live? And we'll go do this other thing. And, it took on a life of its own. But in the second part of my life, when I was kind of a grown up, married and having kids and everything, like I told Carrie a moment ago, that had a lot to do with just who I wanted to be for Jeannie and who I wasn't being in that context. And basically, whatever this is, I don't want to be this. And so, the more high-powered, big-time Christian leaders I met, Jerry Falwell lent me his jet to fly around the country on a speaking tour. I spoke at the pulpit at Liberty University. I was, on the 700 Club 6 or 7 times with Pat Robertson, and our family hung around with people like the Bush family and the Reagans and the Ford family. My parents were staying in the White House. For a minute, we were right in that whole thing that then, by the way, later became the world that elected Donald Trump.
That's where I kind of want to go, is I want to go to that place of the intersection of evangelicalism and politics, especially relating to oppression, and the legislation of certain people's bodies, right? Not everybody's bodies, but some bodies, Black and brown bodies, women's bodies, trans bodies, and the powers and the way that evangelicalism has become a political movement since the 80s, essentially late 70s, early 80s. So I would love for you to continue that train of thought.
To what you're saying, where I'll start sort of backward here, and that is yes and no, because evangelicalism has so changed its own character that now you have very reputable studies doing statistical things from various universities and think tanks showing that the majority of Americans who voted for Trump in the sort of MAGA red state stuff, who identify as evangelicals, when asked what time, when was the last time you ever went to church, they can't name it, because evangelicalism is no longer evangelical. It is so thoroughly political that they now are a good follower. Their personal savior is now Donald Trump, not Jesus Christ. So where we started was by bringing, if I can put it this way, real and sincere evangelicals into the political fight, as in your country's being taken away from you. Let's push back on abortion, feminism, gay rights, whatever it may be. But it in turn became so politicized that, and I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but it resembled more the Lutheran Church in Germany in the 1930s, that was more National Socialist following Hitler than it was Lutheran anymore. Mm-hmm. And we're at that place here in America now, so that we have to, it's getting complicated. When we define the term evangelical, do we mean evangelicalism as I was raised in, that went to the right to defend white nationalism, Christian nationalism? Or do we mean the Trump cult, which is a new American fascism, literally straight up, not hyperbolically, that has then in turn so overwhelmed the desire to follow Christ that Jesus isn't even a factor anymore. And evangelical is now a political label spelled in red capitals right up there with MAGA hats.
Right.
So that it's interchangeable. So I don't know which one are you thinking about?
Yeah, I have to give the shout out to my favorite advisor and professor at seminary, Scott C., who is very adamant that what we are seeing in this movement is actually not evangelicalism. He says it's fundamentalism, but it has been given the label of evangelicalism. And that evangelicalism is actually something much more liberative. And so I think it's really important to point out that what we are actually seeing in this political movement is, and I want to know about that trajectory, right? Like where do you think that turning point happened? Where do you think
I can tell you exactly what happened. And this one I really know about. I know I just said you're uncertain about everything, but I know this one because I was there, literally there. And it follows the trajectory of my own lifetime. So this is the one area where you actually are talking to an expert. Everything else is bullshit, but I know about this.
Go for it.
I'll give you a short answer. Power is seductive. That's it. And the evangelicals for years of the kind I was raised with, we felt like outsiders. Hey, whatever they're teaching you in school about evolution, here's the real truth. It's what we believe. Whatever they say about Jesus, that he couldn't have been, here's what, he couldn't have been raised from the dead, but here's what we believe. We had this kind of alternative belief system where everything else was fake news. And what we had was the truth. And so when someone came along in Donald Trump speaking that language, he was already talking to people convinced that the world was against them. Mm-hmm. Where he changed everything, though, was that evangelicals stopped seeing themselves as outsiders and begin to understand themselves as insiders. So people like, Franklin Graham could whisper in Donald Trump's ear and get the appointment to the Supreme Court he wanted. real things started happening. So, back in the day when I was out there speaking on the hustings, we never saw ourselves as insiders. We were outsiders who were lucky if we got invited to the White House to have dinner or something, like my parents did. But we didn't, we weren't made presidential advisors. But when Paula White sits there in the White House office, this flaky woman puts her hand on Donald Trump's shoulder and prays with him, and then her friends at the, on the evangelical right, like Franklin Graham, encouraged Trump to appoint Gorsuch to the court so he can get Roe overturned or whatever it may be. All of a sudden, that's a taste of real power. And that is so seductive that basically it's a drug. And the evangelical movement went from a kind of a lip service to following Jesus to to hell with that. We're what we really want is an inside track to bringing this country back to the way we want it. And wait a minute, is that to make everybody an evangelical Christian? No, it's to impose our theocratic view on women, gay people, Black people, whoever comes along, because we're in charge now. We have tasted power, and they can't get past that now. So, Tim Alberta has, I'm glancing over here at the book that I just interviewed him about, written this book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And Tim is a very fine journalist who's written a book basically comparing the evangelical Christianity he was raised on, exactly what we're talking about, Carrie and David here, to what has actually happened to the evangelical community and who they really follow. And he tells the stories of pastors who have been fired by their right-wing congregations when they try to call them back to actually following Jesus. And
there was an article. Yeah, there was an article in Christianity Today, I believe, where that talked about how pastors are preaching from the Sermon on the Mount and their congregants are getting angry at them and saying, stop preaching that woke stuff, right? The congregation has no idea who Jesus was and what he stood for.
Right. And hey, by the way, and that's the ones that even showed up for church.
Right.
The guy living on some farm in Idaho with, 1,500 rounds of ammunition and 5 automatic weapons, he's not even going to church. He's just being, a white Christian nationalist getting ready for whatever Armageddon comes along if Trump's not elected again. So there's a whole range there, but it's not the evangelicalism I was raised with, which is not to let them off the hook, because the silence of the leaders who could have spoken up when it began to all go over the edge weren't there. And again, this is going to sound self-serving, but not many walked away and said, I can't do this anymore the way I did 35, 40 years ago. And basically they stuck with the program because they liked the money, they liked the power, they liked the connection, and they did not have the good fortune to be given any alternatives to leave. And that's, I think, would describe many pastors who are still in that fold and who know better. They know this isn't the theology. Right?
Do you think it's fair to say that evangelicalism, or to honor Scott, fundamentalism, disguised as evangelicalism, is a system of dominance in and of itself because of the ways that it operates to cover up, like we've seen the Willow Creek debacle, right? With the sexual harassment and that all the fall from grace that happened there. And all of the ways that those kinds of abuses of power are covered up. Would you agree that it is a system of dominance in and of itself, and that participates in oppressive?
I would go even further. I'd go much further than that, and I would say that's not a knock only on evangelical fundamentalism or evangelicalism tending to fundamentalism. That's a knock on all religious fundamentalism globally. Who the fuck do you think the Saudi Arabians are? Who do you think the Ayatollahs of Iran are? Who do you think the Hindu nationalists in India are, sending out assassination squads globally to get rid of people who criticize them? Look, this is not just an American phenomena, it's a human phenomena. And I'll just put it this way. Absolute certainty kills. And I'll put it another way. I wrote down somewhere, no one ever bombed an abortion clinic after yelling, but I could be wrong.
Yes. That's right.
And so it isn't just a North American problem. It's not a white problem. It's not a racist problem. It's not a feminism versus sexist problem. It is a global problem because we human beings are, angels and demons. And nothing appeals to the worst side of humans more than absolute certainty manifest in circling the wagons and deciding who's an insider and who's an outsider. Mm-hmm. And that's an ancient evolutionary trait in the human species. It's great when it comes to it takes a village and we support each other. But then once you decide who the outsider is and you go after them, whether it's black on black violence in Africa or the Arabs sweeping in the 7th century to North Africa and converting everybody to Islam by the sword, or the Christian conquistadors arriving in South America, it's always the same person. We just change the color of our skin or our hat or our gender or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to go back a few steps here to really look at our little blue marble floating in space and say, what's the real human condition? The real human condition is one of seesawing between a kind of an Enlightenment idea of caring for people and do unto others, which also manifests in all religion and cultures, and basically is the basic thing that evolution teaches us, which is the survival of the friendliest. The only reason you and me are talking today is because someone in our past lifted us up when we fell down in our ancestors' past. Mm-hmm. Margaret Mead used to say the evidence of the first civilization is when you found a fossilized healed femur that had been broken of a human skeleton because you knew someone had stopped and helped.
Right.
Otherwise, that person would be dead. Well, that's who we are as humans. That's the bright side. The downside is, if you look globally right now, what do we share with everybody in the world right now? A huge battle between what you might call humanistic Enlightenment ideas of freedom and self-expression and these dominating fundamentalist theocratic instinct to use religion, not because they could give a shit about religion, but because that keeps them in power. And that's why there are young women being raped as we speak in the jails of the Ayatollahs in Iran, because they had the temerity to tell them to fuck off and took off their headscarves. Mm-hmm. It's not just us. It's a phenomenon where religion gets fundamentalist religion, absolute beliefs with no uncertainty, are the perfect tool for despots.
Yes.
They're the perfect tool. Hey, what do you think Vladimir Putin is such a big? Why is Tucker Carlson his fan? Because Vladimir Putin is an absolutist in bed with the Russian Orthodox Church oligarchs and primates who are bolstering his mad, quest for total domination and dressing it up with religious fundamentalism. In this case, Russian Orthodox.
Well, this is medicine. So thank you. We are getting running out of time here, but I wanted to ask you something that's unrelated to all of that. And I don't even know if you remember this at all, but it's got to be at least a decade or longer. We were on the phone. You asked me to recommend a book that could explain the Black condition in the United States. And do you remember which book it was?
I'm guessing let me just think. The New Jim Crow.
That was it. Michelle Alexander.
And I read it, and it was one of the books that changed the way I see the world.
Wow.
That's a good one.
And I was sincere in my question. It wasn't some bullshit, some of my best friends are Black question. It was a real question. Because I recognize my ignorance when it comes to race, in the sense that, I am who I am, but I really wanted to know. And I'll tell you what, I've never read anything better since then on the subject. I just think it was an incredible book, and it had a huge resonance with me. So thank you so much for recommending it, because man, did that stick.
This is good to know.
I have a question. As an atheist who prays to God, do you ever get an answer?
I think I get an answer every day. And I don't know whether it's just the goodness of evolution and the fact that, love is real, or whether I'm getting answered. But again, I don't care about the uncertainty. My wife, Jeannie, hopes and thinks there's probably some sort of afterlife. And I hope she's right, because I'd like to see her again. And so my answer is always framed as a question. But man, do I feel that there is a goodness in the universe that I tap into? Absolutely. Just in the forgiveness that has been extended to me by Jeannie, to my children, my grandchildren for failings, and the second and third chances and fifth chances I've been given by people around me. literally, I see the grace of God and things like that. My producer of my podcast, Ernie Gregg, who is gay and married to a pastor, ironically, who's also gay. Ernie, I send Ernie my commentaries, and I always see grace in the fact that, unlike these unhinged people who can say whatever they want, the Elon Musk of the world, I've given Greg one rule. I said, if you don't like it, don't post it. If you want to edit it. Because if we don't submit to the fact there are people around us who are wiser than we are, or will help us not to be our worst selves, then we are absolutely terminally fucked. And so I'm glad that, because I've had this long marriage and I'm a parent, a grandfather, if I've learned one thing is, Frank Schaeffer, you do not know it all. Submit to the editor, listen to other people. And I see God's grace in that. And that's one of the evidences for me that there's something out there more than just my will and thrashing around here on this planet. And I'll end that little sermon by saying this, and that is, I see the best things that have ever happened to me have come packaged as my biggest failures. Because I've learned from them.
Amazing.
Hey, Terri,
it's not, hey, I totally failed at a lot of things. And those are the things that basically helped me get past something. It's not the successes. The successes are when we feel self-sufficient and I know everything. That's exactly the opposite of what we were talking about, giving up power. But it's accepting the truth and reality of the failure, where I have found the grace of God.
Yeah, Frank, you're preaching the gospel.
Indeed.
And Carrie, I was going to ask you, don't you think that as much as anybody we've hosted, that Frank reflects the name of our show? I mean,
indeed. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. I love it. I love it so much. Well, I will say, as we close, because I know I want to be respectful of your time, and we know you're on a tight schedule, I think, today. But one thing that I will say, if you want to, I don't know if you've ever read a book called Journey of the Soul, but if you've ever read it, I highly recommend it. It's a little bit mind blowing. So,
well, do me a favor and follow up, because you have my email, right?
Mm-hmm. David does, yes.
Terry, follow up, please, and email me the title, because in this space, I'm not thinking straight. Remember, I've got this great excuse now. I'm 71. I can fuck up anything and just say, hey, I'm old.
Awesome. I love it.
So it's great. You'll see when you get there. A few years from now, it's just, hey, what do you want? I'm old.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much.
But anyway, in all seriousness, email me that and be in touch with me, both of you. And please, if either of you want to come and be in conversation in Frank Schaeffer and you have something you want to talk about, please invite yourselves. Just email me and say, tell Ernie to book me and I'll do it. So if you have a book or whatever, and I'd like to be in touch with you and keep running ideas by you.
I would love that. That would be amazing.
Well, everybody, it's been a joy to host Frank Schaeffer. You've been listening to a conservative fundamentalist Christian.
And a hard-ass one at that.
Oh, we love it. This has been fun.
We love it so much. Thank you so much, Frank. It was such a pleasure to meet you.
Hey, me too. And thank you again. It's really been great. So let Ernie know when this is posted and where, so we can put it on our streams as well, because I've so enjoyed the conversation.
We definitely will. Thank you.
Right.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at God is not an asshole, or text 805-703-8393, because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole.